Hello, I'm Olena Gryniuk and we are recording our next episode of SME Banking Conversations in Prague again. Yesterday we had our CEE 22 SME Banking Conference here, and today I'm taking the opportunity to talk to John McWilliams, who flew in from London. John, I'm very excited that we are recording this interview here in Prague with you, that we met personally after the pandemic finally, and we can talk.
And I'm absolutely delighted to be here, Olena, and again in person, of course, because we've been without person-to-person conversations for years now.
Yeah. So, John, I would like to start this interview from a question about you. Mm-hmm. So now you are CEO of the Institute of Leadership and Management in London, and previously you were head of the Agile Consortium in the UK, and also with the background in Santander, UK, and in the SME banking actually. Yep. Please tell to our viewers about you.
Okay, well, I suppose from an SME banking perspective, my career started several years ago in stockbroking. Actually, I spent about 6 years in stockbroking and corporate finance, and that was, I think, the first place that I began to learn about business and how business worked. After I spent those years in stockbroking, I went to live overseas for a while in the Middle East and the Far East for quite some time. Okay. I had my own company in the Far East for a while, and I spent quite a lot of time supporting other businesses in the Far East and in the Middle East. And that was, I suppose, a deeper education in how business worked, not just my own business, which I learned about, but also how it related to other businesses developing. And then I spent several years actually helping companies to do business internationally. And that sort of added a third layer, which was about how to do international business and how other people approach international business. So when I moved into running professional bodies, I first of all joined the Agile Business Consortium as the chief exec there, and then moved on to the Institute of Leadership and Management. And interestingly, both of those added not so much another layer to my understanding, almost a wrapper, so that I could begin to understand, well, clearly the way that businesses, particularly SMEs, do business is like this. Actually, agility can add another dimension to the way in which they do business. And then, of course, something that I had picked up quite early on in my career, the importance of leadership and the way leadership is delivered within SMEs makes a tremendous difference to their prospects for success or otherwise. So that's a quick run through my career journey.
Yes, and SMEs are really very agile compared to corporates, right? Much more agile.
Yeah, and there's a sort of obvious reason for that, which is, of course, that SMEs live much closer to break even in most cases. I remember having a conversation with the chairman of a very large corporate, a car company in Europe, and we were talking about their success or otherwise in Europe, and he said, we have, in the last year, just made our first profit in Europe for 10 years. Yep. And I thought, how could an SME ever even think I could go for 10 years without making a profit? So the difference between SME and large corporate, even quite large SMEs, which might be turning over 15, 20 million, the difference between them and a large corporate is so big that it's very difficult for corporates to grasp at all.
Yeah. Yesterday at our conference, you said a very interesting and game-changing thought, I would say. The sentence that to do SME banking, you should be rather SME than the banker.
Yes.
Let's develop this topic because we were talking with you also previously about this gap between SMEs and bankers, or right, understanding how real SME business happening by the bankers at the moment.
Yeah, and this understanding gap, and the understanding gap is an academic concept that goes back about 25 years or more possibly. It's so important in SME banking because banking, first of all, is not just a process. It's actually a foundation for all other business because without finance, it's very difficult for a business to achieve anything at all. So banking plays a particular role in the life of business. Banking plays an even more important role in the life of SMEs because, as I mentioned before, SMEs can't afford to go for 10 years without making a profit. And they need to be able to manage finance in particular ways. So the understanding gap between a large corporate, a bank, and its SME clients becomes crucially important. To bridge that gap, that understanding gap, there needs to be obviously an understanding. And one of the things that I believe is that it's almost impossible for somebody who has never been in an SME, let alone run an SME, to really grasp how it works. And for a banker, an SME banker who is in a very large corporate, is trained as a banker, and that's right, because of course they work for banks, they need to be trained as bankers. However, if their clients are SMEs, then actually that understanding gap exists, and it exists largely. And my quite provocative statement is, and I think I sincerely believe this, that SME bankers, to be successful, need to be first SMEs and not bankers. So when it comes to how do we make the transition to SME bankers who can be effective with SMEs, the question then arises, do we retrain the bankers that we've already got?
Is it possible at all?
Yeah, is it possible at all? And I suspect it may not be. And that's not a fault in SME bankers. They were recruited with certain competencies and characteristics and capabilities to do banking.
Back then, yes.
Yeah, indeed. And some of them many years ago, actually, and they were recruited as bankers and they have performed successfully as bankers. However, the success that banks now need to see or want to see with SMEs requires those bankers to think differently about how their clients work.
How banks can do this? What is the way out?
There are, I suppose, two routes. One of them is retraining, and that sounds very, sounds very straightforward. Actually, it's not, of course, because it's not just the functions of SME banking that need to change, because actually they could be changed quite easily just by changing the rules. Right? So one of them is retraining. The other one is recruiting different people. If we think about the first one first, the retraining, the challenge with that is this idea that what makes up the understanding gap is the mindset. And that's the big difference.
And is it possible to change?
Absolutely. And I'm not sure it is, as I said, unless somebody has worked in an SME, run an SME, owned an SME perhaps, it's very difficult to appreciate the things which differentiate a bank from an SME. And I think that there are a couple of things. One of them is time, the sense of time. And you and I have talked before about the fact that actually SMEs can't wait 2 or 3 months to be paid.
Exactly.
Because actually they live not necessarily from hand to mouth, but they need to be paid.
Yes, they need quick payments, real time, quick credit decisions.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what is interesting is the technology is there for that to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
There's no technical barrier to that being done at all. The barriers are in the mindset of the bank.
Right.
And interestingly, I think those barriers are at several levels. In the SME bankers themselves who are challenged not because they don't want to help their clients, of course they do, they are required by the bank to perform in a particular way. They have a P&L account that they have to fulfill. They need to do certain things. They are targeted and they are rewarded based upon how they fulfill the expectations of the bank, which is set by the mindset of the people at the top of the bank who are not running an SME. They're running a corporate that's worth billions. So it's very difficult for any SME banker to actually do what their SME clients need, because they may well not then perform the way the bank wants them to. So that's the retraining needs to be done at a number of levels, and particularly actually at the top of the bank, in order for the people at the top of the bank to give permission for those people who are dealing with SMEs to deal with them in the right way. So there will be all sorts of changes in the reward structure of banks and stuff like this. The other way to maybe change the situation is this idea about who banks recruit.
And how to recruit, because it's really difficult. Nobody wants to work in the bank these days.
It's interesting that banks are not notably a preferred employer, except for people who want to earn money. Because of course traders in banks will often earn quite a lot of money, and I can understand that, because there's nothing wrong with wanting to earn some money, and a bank is a good vehicle for doing that for many people. However, banks do have a reputation for being quite not harsh but unforgiving employers. You can either do the business or not, and if you can't do the business, then understandably the bank, which has shareholders and has profit targets to hit, probably will not hang on to that person. Interestingly, one of the things that I did when I was with Santander for about 4 years, I think I worked with Santander, and I set up and ran their breakthrough program.
Yes, let's talk about this later on.
Breakthrough was really, really interesting, because the idea behind it was that, of course, banks provide financial support to companies. That's why they exist in an SME context.
Not always, actually. Providers, we see the last 2 years, banks were restricted in that as well.
Yes, indeed.
I mean, access to SME finance is still
difficult.
Challenging.
Absolutely, yes, indeed. So in theory, at least, banks provide finance for SMEs. However, finance is not the only thing that SMEs need in order to be successful. And I have a model where there are 5 core functions in a business: strategy, marketing, operations, people, and finance. So if we allow, in theory, the bank already provides the finance. If the SME needs the other 4 things to be done successfully in order to prosper, can the bank help them in those other 4 areas: strategy, marketing, operations, and people? And the answer is yes. So we did with Breakthrough in Santander. We just set up a little team, and because a bank, one of the reasons banks don't do this sort of thing is because they're specialists in finance. Okay.
Exactly.
They also, because they're banks, they know everybody. Banks know all sorts of businesses and people in all sorts of areas. So if an SME needs help in marketing, the bank doesn't need to say, we can't help you with that, we do finance. They can say, we know people who do marketing. We can connect you. And that was the principle behind Breakthrough. And it was very successful in one way in particular, which is that it demonstrated to the SMEs with whom we worked over those 4 years.
So you work with scale-ups, right, within this program?
Yes, exactly right. And a lot of businesses. We did a number of events with 350 businesses would come and listen to what we had to say. And what made the difference was that the SMEs began to realize this particular bank was wanting to understand how they worked. So wanting to bridge that understanding gap to enable them to work effectively. And that word partner that you just mentioned then was the way that we presented Breakthrough. Okay. And it's not actually that difficult a concept. And it's difficult for banks to do, and it was very difficult for Santander to do because it costs money. And this is the key.
And knowledge. What I hear now from the banks, and here at least from the Central Eastern Europe region, that one of the main stoppers of not implementing at the moment beyond banking services for the SME is actually the lack of knowledge inside the organization. So there is no specialist in the bank knowing how to offer invoicing, accounting, and other non-financial services for SMEs to support their businesses. And this is one of the stoppers. So it is really difficult from the financial point of view, but also from this knowledge point of view.
That's absolutely right. And if we think that those beyond banking services are difficult for the bank to source from specialists and experts within the bank, because actually the specialists and experts are outside, we think about non-banking services and marketing or HR or strategy. Those are even more difficult for the bank to access. And the only way that I guess it could be done was Santander brought somebody like me in that had a network of connections that were not banking, that were associated with all of those other functions. And it does cost money because that team they didn't have a P&L, it didn't generate revenue directly for the bank. The aim of that team was to create a relationship with SMEs that would enable them to come to the bank to voluntarily, because they saw the bank as being willing to understand. There's no reason why any other bank should not do that other than cost.
Was it a big team?
It wasn't a big team. There were, I think, 6 of us in the end. In total, at the largest point, there were about 6 of us. And the most interesting thing about the whole exercise, I think, really was back to this idea of mindset. And the team's job was not just to connect with lots of SMEs and to bring them in and let them see what the bank could do. It was also actually to connect the people in the bank with the SMEs, to try and shift some of the mindset within the SME bankers. And we were moderately successful, I'd say, in that. And I wouldn't say more than that, because it's always very difficult until the bank says, okay, we will reward you, SME banker, differently because you're working with SMEs, then it's different for that banker to actually behave in any way other than as they normally do. So I'd be really keen to see other banks think about how do we provide, certainly beyond banking services like factoring, etc., or how do we connect SMEs with these, and then how do we connect SMEs with other things. One of the examples was, say, in marketing. We took a group of SMEs along to see one of the world's best brand management companies. And they did a day-long masterclass for 25 SMEs, which those SMEs could never have afforded from this global brand company. And then the SMEs went away with a brand management plan devised with this global company, which they couldn't otherwise have had. And that was great, because that was the bank, which is a global business, talking to another global business and saying, how can we help smaller companies? And we can give them a day-long workshop and a brand management plan. And of course, it costs the brand management company almost nothing to do that. It's a day of somebody's time. And the SMEs get something unique that they could not have got. So that's the sort of simplicity of action and activity that can be taken. But it requires a mindset that actually sees that as being valuable to the bank.
Do you think that now, when especially during this last two years, that the SME environment has changed a lot? All the business environment has changed, both for the banks and for SMEs. Does it require new skills for SME bankers and maybe for the SME banking leaders?
Yes, and for the SMEs.
For the SMEs.
And I think that's the driver of the need for new skills in SME bankers and the leadership within SME banking is the fact that SMEs themselves have changed so much over the course of the last 2 or 3 years.
And maybe they're changing quicker?
Well,
than the bankers?
Without a doubt. And one of the things that the pandemic did for us was that it made immediately evident what is important and what is not, what adds value and what does not. And it actually highlighted the agility that SMEs have,
yes.
or not, because some of them were not able to cope with it.
Right.
So SMEs that coped well have learned to be more agile than they ever were, because they were forced to be so. As a result, the pressure on SME bankers to think in a more agile way has increased.
Right.
And we may or may not have seen that produce a change in behaviour. In some banks it has, in some it certainly hasn't. The key, again, is to think about this at layers in the bank, and it's at leadership level where the difference needs to be made. And I have to say my experience of leadership in corporates generally is that agility is well regarded and often thought about a lot and not too often practiced.
Okay.
There are relatively few companies which were not born agile, and many of them web-based companies and things like this, which might be enormous companies, Amazon, Google, people like this. They were born agile. There are very few companies that were not born agile that have achieved agility in their thinking. And I certainly don't see much in the way of agility yet from the leadership in SME banking. And it's partly, maybe it's partly, because SME banking is not yet thought of as a thing within banking. We know retail exists.
Yes.
Business banking, which is smaller and medium-sized businesses, and then corporate. Well, actually, business banking is, in many banks, is seen as a different version of retail, without understanding that it's not the same. SME banking, which encompasses those people who are running a business and who want to grow that business, not just have a bank account, they want to grow the business. Actually, that's not retail banking. It's a banking, a particular type of banking where the bank needs to, back to mindset, needs to understand the ambitions and aspirations of the business and think about how do we partner with that business to achieve them. And it's a shame that SME banking is not thought of as almost a career path within banking.
Right.
That's what I would really like to see.
Yes, yes. Who, on your opinion, who can we call as a successful SME banker, right? Kind of, what does it mean to be successful in SME banking, and whether there is the same as to be innovative in SME banking?
Oh, right. Okay. I think the characteristics of someone who could be a successful SME banker. The first one is that they are a banker. Okay. And I know I said earlier on they should be SMEs, not bankers, but actually they do need to know a little bit about banking. They need to know much more about being an SME. Okay. And of course, our existing cohort of SME bankers are actually not in that place yet. So existing successful SME banker would be an SME banker who thinks, how do I understand a bit more about this SME? How do I partner with them to achieve their ambitions, not just the banks? That's the starting point for existing SME bankers. And I actually think they will be surprised and will surprise themselves at just how interesting it is when you start to understand how an SME works and just how easily the bank can help them by connecting them with the right people. So successful SME banker from the existing cohort moves from banking towards SME. Successful SME banker in the future starts with SME. And as I said earlier, then learns about banking. Because I think it's, and I'm sure there are bankers out there who will disagree with this, I don't think banking is a very complicated or difficult function. The competitive advantage that banks used to have before fintechs and a number of other services was made up of three things. they had a customer service operation, they had risk assessment, and they had transactional ability. So in theory, nobody needs to give their money to a bank, because if I trust you, then I could give you all my money and say, please look after that for me, Olena. However, the transactional ability needs to be done through a regulated organization. So then you would lose a competitive advantage against the banks. So the banks have what? They have allowed that competitive advantage to be disrupted somewhat. Partly customer service, I mentioned. Well, you know, banks don't have a great reputation, most of them, for customer service. And I'm talking about SME banking in particular here. Risk assessment, again, the reputation is a bit tarnished because it takes far too long to assess an SME for a loan. Usually the need for the loan has actually passed by the time the SME gets the nod for it. It also can cost money, because if the bank has to do due diligence, then the SME will often have to pay for that, and will usually have to pay for that. And then the transactional ability, well, actually lots of people can transact a financial transaction now, not just the bank. So there are lots of things which have gone away from banks in terms of their competitive advantage. I think really, I'm not sure where they go from here without a willingness to attract and recruit SMEs into banking, or individuals who understand SMEs into banking, and then to train them in banking. I think the future is a bit challenging for banks in the SME field, because sooner or later, those fintechs who are increasingly successful in the retail banking sphere and already doing things for businesses, and particularly those non-banking services that you mentioned, factoring and things like this, they will start to creep further and further into the role that banks have been playing. And
until the regulators.
Well, until they're the least, this is classic disruption. This is a classic disruptive model. And I think, interestingly, one of the things somebody said to me once when we were talking about the future of banking, and they said, the only reason that, the only thing that keeps banks alive is regulators. And I thought about it, and I thought, actually, yeah, because if there were no regulators, then competition would be absolute, and there would be an awful lot of people doing things that banks currently do. And regulators are protecting banks for good reason, because the regulations are there to protect us as customers. However, there is a question mark over whether or not regulators ought to allow other organizations into there.
John, what is your inspiration to do a better job?
Oh, what a good question. I think it sounds, in a way, it sounds almost foolish, but it's my inspiration is actually I'd like to help people do a better job of what they do, and not least because it's enormously pleasing and gratifying when you see somebody achieve something, particularly if they thought they couldn't do it. You see them achieve it, and the pleasure that they get from that, I get it too. And I think that's what keeps me going, really, especially because, you know, from an SME banking perspective, SMEs struggle. I know I've been an SME and I run an SME right now. And actually to do whatever we can to help SMEs succeed in that struggle is what keeps me going, I think.
Yeah, I'm very inspired by this conversation with you, John. Thank you very much for this.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you very much indeed, Olena, for the opportunity.